Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher, and you're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Here we go again, back to our study in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 3, and if you guys would drop down to verse 13, Paul writes, and yes, Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. If you don't believe me, just go to 2 Peter 3:15 and read those verses. Peter actually tells his followers that you now have to listen to Paul, because Paul has all the newest information, just like he wrote to you in the book of Hebrews. So Hebrews 3:13, Paul writing, but exhort one another daily. What does that mean? How many times a week does the average Christian even think about spiritual things? Usually it's Sunday morning, right? 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, whenever your service is on. It's probably about as far as it ever goes. I'm not just talking about mundane churchgoers, Sunday morning, 11 o'clocker. You're in the pew for an hour, you go home, you turn on the TV, you watch a football game or the Masters until next Sunday. But people, that's not what the book says. The word says that every time believers bump into one another, what should we be talking about? Sports? Weather? Politics? No, none of those things. The Word. The Word. Spiritual things. And this is why I get so excited. Whenever I go home and look in my mail, and, almost 90% of the things people write to me are about spiritual things. And I don't go in and try and worm these things out of people. It just happens. So we're supposed to exhort one another daily, why it is called today. So when Paul writes this term today, it's for us. In this age of grace, today for us is now. For the people living today, this is your opportunity. And since you have this warning, while we're still in the age of grace, you still have the opportunity of expressing your faith to the lost out there, and hopefully getting some of them to embrace it. And Paul tells you that you're supposed to do this every day. I do it every day. I do it through my podcast. You know how you can do it? Huh? Share my podcast with all your friends, especially your lost ones. Hebrews goes on in 3:13, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Now, I want to take 3 words out of that verse. And the book of Hebrews, somehow or another, enhances this stuff. And remember a few weeks back I was teaching on how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation. I spent a whole half hour on those 3 words. So, how do we escape if we neglect? So you've got 3 phrases here that are just loaded, but the average reader just skims right over them and never sees them. Lest any of you be hardened. What does that mean? Lest any of you be hardened? How can you be hardened? Through the deceitfulness of sin. That's going to be the first one. So, I'm going to take them in reverse order. So go back to that word sin. In the Greek, the word is anomia. Now, I'm not really a Greek scholar. I know a little bit. But I want everyone to know that once in a while, you can look up a word in the Greek dictionary and find out what the translation is. And the translation of anomia is lawless or lawlessness. Now, put your thinking caps on for a second. Lawlessness. To be lawless. Isn't that exactly what sin is all about? Isn't the first step of sin the mental act of rebelling against what God has said? That's what it means to be lawless. Adam and Eve did it in the garden. Now just think for a second. The sin that so easily besets us and plagues us and the human race starts out as lawlessness. God gave Adam and Eve a commandment. Do not eat of the tree. That's his law. And they broke it. They were lawless. So now God has made certain provisions for the human race, certain instructions. But what is the natural reaction to all that? It's like when your mom and dad says, don't do this. Don't pull all the flowers out of the garden, Jimmy. What's the first thing I do? I go pull all the flowers out of the garden. I say, no. You can't tell me what to do. Now look at Psalm 14 for a second. When the translators add a word, I think it's foolish. I think it takes away the punch. The fool has said in their heart, there is no God. That's one of the Psalms in 14. But you take away what the translator added, which is there is. The fool has said that there is no God. You take away that, and it says the fool has said in his heart, what? No God. Now, I'm not going to do what you're telling me to do, is what you say. That's lawlessness. And like I said, began all the way back with Adam and Eve. Look at what happens in Isaiah 14, verse 12. Go ahead and go there. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer? Now, some of your translations don't have Lucifer, but in the old King James it does say Lucifer. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground? Why didst weaken the nation? For thou hast said in thy heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit upon the mountain of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will be like the Most High. So what's he saying here? Oh, Lucifer. He's going to usurp God's throne and his authority. God tell him to do that? He's lawless. He does everything contrary to everything that God has stipulated, and he's telling God in so many words, I'm going to take your place. So Lucifer is the beginning of lawlessness, or sin as we know it in our human experience. And then you go right back up to Genesis chapter 3, and Lucifer ends up tempting Eve back there in the garden. She falls for it. And then Adam makes the poorest decision of all time. And he eats of it also. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat. Wherefore, Romans 5:12, as by one man, Adam, sin, lawlessness, entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for they have all sinned. So they've all become lawless. Us. Now let me show you another one in Romans chapter 8. And you know, every time I read this verse, I am so amazed that the human race does as good as it does. And now, we're really going down the tubes fast. We all know that. But it's just amazing that the human race has held on for 6,000 years. Romans chapter 8, verse 6. For to be carnally minded, fleshly minded, is death. But to be spiritually minded is life and peace, because the carnal mind, the unsaved person, is enmity, that's a constant running battle, against God. He's lawless. He doesn't want to do what God says to do. He doesn't pay any attention to the precepts of God. He does it his own way. He's lawless. He's doomed. But look at what the rest of the book says. Because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can it be? How come? Because it's lawless. You can't be subject to the law of God if you're lawless. If you don't pay any attention to the law, if you scoff at the law, you're not subject to the law. Right? Just makes common sense. So one day, the righteous judge is going to confront all the years of lawlessness. That's when all the people of all the ages fall into the hands of a living God. And that living God is not going to be a God of mercy and grace anymore. Too late for that person. Now watch what happens in Hebrews 3:13. Exhort one another daily what it is to call today in this age of grace, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. As it is written, watch this in Romans 3:10, there is none righteous, no, not one. So when Hebrews 3:13 says that today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin, what does the word harden imply? Well, the further people get into sin, the more their consciences are seared against what's right and what's wrong. It doesn't bother them anymore. And God finally gives them over to a reprobate mind. And they go to these sinful places without batting an eye. They become hardened to it. So now when you do go back to Romans, and it says, as it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one, that comes out of the Old Testament. But it's always been that way. Nobody understands it. There's none that seeketh after God. How come? They got their own lawlessness. They're obeying their own law. They don't care what God says. Romans 3:11. There's none that understand it. There is none that seeketh after God. There are none. All have gone out of the way. They are all become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good. No, not one. Man, when my wife read that, she started bawling. First time she ever read the Bible, she starts out in Romans 3. Does that make any sense? Romans 3:13 through 18 says, their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of the asp, a poisonous snake, is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. How come? Because they're lawless. They don't care about the laws of God. Now keep your hand in Romans chapter 3 and flip over to Galatians a second, because this is what the book called it. This isn't my idea. The Word of God says the deceitfulness of sin. And the deceitfulness of sin has a tremendous allurement. I don't think any of us would desire or deny that most sin is alluring. Most temptation is alluring. It has the ability to get your attention, right? So now in Galatians 5, it actually lists what those allurements are. The works of the flesh are manifest. Which are these? Adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, sedition, heresy, envyings, murder, drunkenness, revellings, and such like, of which I tell you before, as I have told you in times past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. That's Paul writing. How come? Because they're lawless. They're hardened by the deceit of sin. They're hardened by the deceit of lawlessness. Now flip back to chapter 3 again in Romans. And it says it so clearly here. It's their lawlessness and they're living in the deceitfulness of sin, which is far worse than they have any idea that it's going to be when they started on the path. They know that they're guilty, and that's why they've got to constantly subject their guilt feelings with more and more of the same. But deep down they know that in the eyes of a holy God, they are guilty. Look at Romans 3:19. Now we know that what things soever the law, it saith to them who are under the law. So in other words, Paul is writing that the law was originally given to the nation of Israel. Israel was put under this system of worship and legality that was associated with it. But it doesn't stop there. The law was given to them who were under the law. Why? That how many mouths should be stopped. Romans 3:19. That every mouth should be stopped. Not just Jew. Not just a Jewish mouth. The whole human race. Mouths should be clamped shut. By what? By the righteousness of the laws of God. Why? Because he's perfect. He's sinless. Now let's finish up right here. Romans 3:19 goes on, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world become guilty before God. Not just Israel. It says right here, all the world. And what does guilt demand? A sentence, right? Look, you do something wrong, you go before a court of law, and when the judge slams that gavel down and he says you're guilty, what happens next? He sentences you. And that's what's going to happen at the great white throne. The guilty world is going to come for sentencing. They will not escape. God's going to have their record. There'll be no argument. It's going to be awful. That's why the world doesn't want to hear about it. Listen, do you hear anybody preach anymore about hell? I had a preacher come to my house a couple of weeks ago and tell me that there is no hell. I almost fell off my chair. So that's going to do it for today's teaching. I hope you guys enjoyed that. That was a tough one, I know. But this is Jim Sedore, and I am your personal Bible teacher, and you're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. We'll get back to it shortly. Everybody have a great day. God bless. Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher. If you like what you hear, and you think your friends and relatives would benefit by the teaching, please share it with everyone you know. Thanks, and have a great day.